Okay, we're live. So, Mrs. Clark left off on Friday telling you the story of Nelson Mandela, his sort of political past, and how he fought against apartheid, and how he spent much of his life in prison as a political symbol, and then apartheid was dismantled in the early 1990s, and he goes on to become president of South Africa. In many ways, it's an amazing personal triumph, one that people throughout the world recognized as significant. And in many ways, it was a groundbreaking event for South Africa to create a new multiracial future. There's a whole lot of positive you could say about that. But what I want to stress today is that this isn't just a story of triumph and vanquishing the problems of the past, but in many ways, it is a much more complicated story, one that is still very much part of the history and current nature of South Africa. So what I'm going to be stressing today are the challenges that awaited Mandela and South Africa after apartheid ended, how they tried to come to terms with some of those challenges through something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and kind of close on a more positive note with something called the Invictus story, which I think you'll find to be fairly uplifting. To start off, I said that while Mandela's election as president and the demise of apartheid were tremendous accomplishments worthy of lots of the international attention that they received at the time, it is not a solve-all for a nation that was gripped for generations in oppressive racial segregation of some of the cruelest kind. You guys read the history of apartheid in South Africa. You looked at the statistics of who had land, who had wealth, who had doctors, who had violence visited upon them, what it was like to live in a homeland, what it was like to carry passbooks. You know all the nature of those things. And this is kind of the first major overarching challenge that awaits Mandela when he becomes president. And that is, how do you deal with the consequences of a systemic and long-term set of advantages and oppressions against a people? And what I mean by that is South Africa was constructed in a very methodical way to ensure that a small portion of the population had incredible advantages, materially, socially, politically. White Afrikaners controlled the government. They had the best land. They had the best doctors. They, in many cases, would live in relative splendor, while massive chunks of the population, the black and colored population, lived on homelands without basic resources afforded to them, as well as, the system of racial separation and how cruel that could be. You saw in the lab what it was like to live under apartheid. So none of that should be shocking to you. But what I want to impress is those advantages and that oppression doesn't go away just because the legal system of apartheid ends. People who still have money and wealth and opportunity and educational background, all of that momentum and inertia still will continue. Yes, you can with now control of the government, you can maybe change some governmental programs. You can decide to spend money more in this area. You can maybe staff the bureaucracy and the administration with new people who are going to fight for justice. You can maybe get a better control of the courts so it's more reliably serving of justice and people's interests. But it's not going to go away soon. Generations upon generations were built on oppression. That will in many ways continue. Another problem that Mandela and South Africa faces is, how do you deal with governmental distrust? Whites went from controlling almost every aspect of power to suddenly having to share power with the non-white majority. Are they going to be okay with that? Is every government official and military official and cabinet minister, are they just going to step aside? Or are the judges and the courts and everybody else going to just simply admit their past wrongs and seek to cooperate in good faith manner? That's a lot of assumption. And while some will, certainly, others are not going to, and others are maybe going to be on the fence to kind of see what happens. Thirdly, how do you get the minority Afrikaner population, the white Afrikaner population, to admit to past wrongs on a mass scale. Millions of people who maybe they weren't exhibiting acts of violence, but they were certainly benefiting from a system that was structured to oppress some and benefit the others. They were benefiting from that privilege. How do you get them to say, not only this was wrong, but I may have committed crimes, or I knew people who committed crimes. I was complicit in crimes. I believed this at one time, and maybe I've changed my views. My father believed this. My grandfather believes this. The whole system has been set up to benefit me. How do you get people to come to terms with that? Finally, how do you deliver a sense of justice? There are going to be millions of people who had cruel political and social acts done to them and their family members, loved ones. We're going to see horrific acts of violence that have happened. How do those people both on one hand, move on to the future, try to let some of their hatred, anger, in many cases, totally just. How do they leave that behind and chart a new future while also having a sense of justice that, the evil and crimes have been faced and that people who have committed those crimes have faced a sense of consequence? How do you do that? How do you satisfy every element of this equation? To kind of put a little finer point on the problems that Mandela and South Africa faced, I have some quick facts on post-apartheid South Africa, some material or economic facts. One big one, and this has been a problem in many societies that have experienced massive social or political upheaval, is that in some cases people just leave the country. An estimated 800,000 or more whites, and this study was done in 2009, like almost 2 decades after the end of apartheid. An estimated 800,000 or more whites have left South Africa since 1995 out of the 4 million white apartheid population. So remember, there were around 4 million whites in South Africa. Around 800,000 have left. In many cases, these are your trained professionals, a lot of the entrepreneur class, a lot of the landholding class, people who had maybe experience in different parts of the bureaucracy. If they and their families leave, not that they can't ultimately be replaced, but with them they take their expertise and their social and political and economic capital, and that's going to be difficult for the country to deal with. This is something that economists will call brain drain. Sometimes if you lose a large portion of your educated professional class. 500,000 white South Africans have emigrated to Britain alone. So Great Britain was kind of caught up in this massive transfer of human capital. There's a growing skills shortage in South Africa amongst non-whites, particularly doctors, nurses, teachers. They're not replacing those or filling those roles as frequently and as steadily as they might want. As of 2008, like I said, this is a somewhat dated statistic, 25,000 teachers were leaving the profession with only 7,000 entering. So you get a little bit of an imbalance there. That's a problem if you're trying to deliver a more complete educational program to your population. If you're not replacing the educational staff at that time, that will create problems in the future. Access to things like medical coverage, household spending, a lot of that is still going to be very much divided on the basis of race. Whites are going to have the advantage. Non-whites are still going to be behind. So let's drill down into some of these social divisions. I mentioned one of those big challenges is how do you get people to admit past wrongs, come to terms with a very ugly and uncomfortable past. How do you do that? There isn't a whole lot of playbooks in world history where you can just point to and say this worked. After the Second World War, there were what are called the Nuremberg trials. You probably talked about that a little bit in U.S. history too. We'll talk about it more here, where you try and bring, evil people to justice and try to give a sense of justice. There's some other instances where governments were toppled in Latin America, where they tried coming to terms with past crimes, but it's often a very flawed process, which leaves not a lot of people satisfied, and many people are, dissatisfied by the process. Because Mandela faced this racial divide, which was at the part of the whole experience of being South African. Mandela orders the establishment of what are called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is going to be the term for the next 5-10 minutes. Underline this. Make sure you have this. Because it's a new and innovative kind of concept at the time, although they've tried versions of it in the past. He orders this in 1996, shortly after coming to power. And the goals of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are this: to face the evils of apartheid and to encourage forgiveness. See what terrible things were done in the past, figure out a way to forgive. Give people a sense of closure, a sense of justice. Give victims, and this is going to be one of the problematic parts of this, messy, uncomfortable parts of this. Give victims of crimes a chance to look the perpetrators of those crimes in the eye and to hear the full truth and potentially grant forgiveness. This was going to be done on a mass scale in the 1990s as a way of moving forward. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. A great quote by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's a higher up in the Anglican Church, and he's a kind of a spiritual and political figure in South Africa and internationally, really. He said at the time, "We need to acknowledge that we had a horrendous past, we as South Africans. We need to look the beast in the eye so that the past wouldn't hold us hostage anymore." This is often sometimes the advice of people who go through a great trauma, that you can't get through the trauma, you can't come to terms with it unless you face it in some way. You can't be trapped in a state of denial, and in many cases that denial can be counterproductive. So this raises the question, if South Africa's history is replete with all of these acts of violence and oppression, why would anybody who had a hand in that, why would they come forward? Why would they participate in this trial? Well, let me give you some explanations why they might. Perpetrators of crimes, if you were a police officer or a security force member, or you were caught up in the political violence on one side or the other, this was an opportunity to kind of put your story out there, to get a fair and open trial where you have a chance to muster evidence, you have a chance to bring in witnesses, you have a chance to say, this is what I was thinking, this is why I did it, I may have believed it at the time, I've come since to regret it. You guys saw one story of this in last week's lab, Life Under Apartheid, the white Afrikaner cabinet official who ordered violent attacks on non-white demonstrators in South Africa, and how he developed a profound sense of regret. And he was trying to come to terms with that. And as an old man, he's like 80 years old, and he was soliciting the forgiveness of black South Africans. So there are these people out there that maybe recognize what they did was wrong. Gives them a chance for a fair and open trial. It gives them an opportunity to clear your conscience. We can't underestimate the power of that. That some people, while they may have been part of the white system of South Africa that inflicted crimes, maybe they felt bad about it. Maybe they didn't believe it at the time. Maybe they since felt bad about it. And it also, and this is the dangling thing that kind of encouraged a lot of people to come forward, is it was a chance to gain amnesty for your crime, a chance to get legal forgiveness. So here's what we're going to do to help you visualize the effects of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. I got about a 6-minute clip to play. Here's the question I want you to answer in your notebook, and there are going to be questions on the test about this, so for those of you, not writing stuff down, not responding to this, that has a direct effect on your ability to perform on the unit test. Here's the question: what seems to be the most challenging aspect of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and why? Why are these difficult? Like I said, they were kind of innovative. They were kind of creative solutions to a very deep set of problems rooted in apartheid. Why are they challenging? And this will play.
Interim constitution and the freeing of political prisoners in 1990. By early 1994, after 4 years of talks and negotiations, the different parties agreed to an interim constitution and an election, which was held on 27 April 1994. Nelson Mandela was sworn in as the country's first democratic president. But how was South Africa going to deal with its violent and repressive past? Simply burying it and trying to forget it, while allowing all those who had committed gross human rights violations in the name of politics to get away with it, were not seen as options. Accountability was a prerequisite for a human rights culture in the new democracy. Some argued strongly for criminal trials for former soldiers, policemen, and their commanders and political bosses, referring to the trials of Nazi war criminals after World War II as example. But it was important to take the white minority along into the New Deal, and even more important for the apartheid security forces to accept a change of political power to the majority. Parliament then came up with a compromise which would reveal and acknowledge the past, but would also promote reconciliation and offer amnesty to perpetrators in return for the truth. The Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act of 1995 created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that had to facilitate this process. Nobel Peace Prize winner Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu was appointed chairperson of the Truth Commission. President Mandela then selected the 17 Truth Commissioners from a short list of 25 names that had been chosen by a multi-party panel. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had its first hearing in East London on 16 April 1996, was not the first Truth Commission in the world.
If you look at some of the more prominent examples of these kinds of truth commissions in Latin America, for example, you have both examples where commissions were set up through presidential decree in Chile and Argentina, both. And one thing about that model is that because they were set up through a presidential decree and not through national legislation, they weren't able to take on certain powers, such as the power to subpoena, which has become so important to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here. But they only had powers to invite.
So you know, the power to subpoena is basically the power to force people to testify before governmental bodies, and that's something that's big when you're trying to come to terms with past crimes and evidence, because a lot of people are maybe just going to stay quiet or try to dodge it.
People, either perpetrators or victims or families that disappeared, to come forward and give testimony. Unfortunately, in both Chile and Argentina, they primarily took evidence from families of the victims and not from perpetrators. They had almost no collaboration from perpetrators, which is strikingly different from South Africa. This is really the only case, because of the amnesty model that has been set up here, where in exchange for the truth, amnesty might be granted. So because of that, there has been a reason for perpetrators to come forward and tell the exact truth.
Make a big difference.
It's absolutely remarkable to me to watch the process here. I mean, it's so much so that I would say most Senate commissions are a commission about a product, and the commission in South Africa is a commission about a process. And it's the process that will affect the country, that is affecting the country.
The Truth Commission was also tasked with painting a picture of the past so that the causes, nature, and extent of political violence could be better understood. The Commission therefore held special hearings and invited role players on all sides of the conflict to make submissions. Special hearings were held on prisons, women, children, the State Security Council, the military and police, the different political parties, the media, the medical profession, the religious communities, and even the behavior of Winnie Mandela's Mandela United Football Club in Soweto in the late 1980s. The Commission had 3 committees overseeing its 3 functions: a Human Rights Violations Committee, an Amnesty Committee, and a Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee. The Human Rights Violations Committee investigated the human rights abuses that occurred in South Africa between 1961 and 1994. Agents of the Commission went into the communities to gather statements from people who were victims or survivors of politically motivated violence. More than 21,000 such statements were gathered. Of these, about 2,000 were invited to tell their stories at public hearings of the Commission. These hearings took place all over South Africa between 1996 and 1998.
It all began here on 15 April 1996 in the Eastern Cape, the womb of apartheid resistance over decades. Here, in the glare of the world's media, they stepped where no one had gone before, and they spoke the first words in the great telling of our shameful and proud past. There were the wounded and the pained.
And I was still 20 at the time, and I couldn't handle this. So I was taken to Nyanu's place, and when I got there, Nyanu was crying terribly.
And then there were those with great loss in their hearts and anger in their veins.
I don't want to cry. Really, I don't want to cry, but I'd like the commission to like me.
They were the brave pioneers of the Truth Commission, those who led all the others to sew their truths into the patchwork quilt of a new history.
There's been a lot of evil. And there's been a lot of evil in this country. It's being exercised.
The Commission sat in noisy cities and quiet dorpies. They sat in big, imposing town halls and dingy schools and churches, from Messina in the north to Cape Town in the south. And from everywhere the victims came. Some were dignified, silver-haired elders, others impassioned young lions. Sometimes they were even small, little lions. The stories were of torture and abduction, rumors that became reality.
This is Piwa's hair. This is the scalp.
They spoke about massacres and wars. They spoke about the death of a single child and about the killing of whole families.
I heard their voices.
Let's talk about your responses to this question. Take 30 seconds and wrap it up if you have not done so. What seems to be the most challenging part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in your view? Who'd like to volunteer? What they thought? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Coming to a place where you could give forgiveness, especially if you lost a loved one or something in a horrific act of violence. Other challenges or problems that could emerge. Yeah.
Having people be open to the idea of forgiveness.
Yeah. I mean, some people, you guys have experienced kind of the full spectrum of humanity. I mean, some people are just naturally more forgiving. Other people are going to hold grudges. And, how do you get past, horrible things inflicted upon people like that? Some people just might not be open to it. Another one. Yeah. Yeah, emotional stability. You have to go through something like this. You have to go through a trial where you relive some really traumatic event. That's hard.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for those 3 volunteers. I walked over here to look at the seating chart because I was expecting to have to call on people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Not in this
I
class.
appreciate that.
Yep. Thanks. Good. And there will there's going to be some more to this as well. Again, the thinking of it was, and as I said, there aren't a whole lot of examples in world history where you could just point to this for how you go forward with this. There was going to be people on both sides who maybe were in favor of these, people who said, no, I think it's actually going to do more harm than good. It's going to leave a lot of people dissatisfied. But the thinking at the time is expressed in this cartoon, is that you have to face traumatic events of the past. You can't live in a state of denial if you're going to ultimately get past something. As it says here, if we don't find out what is in there, it will keep haunting us forever, and that's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a source of light, and South Africa's past being what it needs to be cast upon. So the possibility of amnesty, just to reiterate what this means, amnesty, it's an official pardon. It's legal forgiveness, if you've never heard the term, for a violation or infraction of the law or of a system. To receive amnesty for your crime, one must provide the complete truth and testimony about your crimes. If you're caught in a lie, if you're trying to, cast doubt upon or play with the truth in this as a way to save yourself or to save someone else, that would make you ineligible for amnesty. You have to prove that your crimes had a political motivation, that it wasn't just cold-blooded murder for some personal matter, but it was part of a political situation. If you were a police officer or a security force who had fired upon somebody or killed some people or taken part in a really violent situation, that would be kind of one of those political moments. And also you had to prove your crimes were reasonable for the time. You had to somehow demonstrate that you were caught in the teeth of this apartheid system, that you were, in many ways not able to see through, the cruel oppression nature of the regime, the apartheid regime that is, and that you've since come to a sense of justice and regret about that. I want to read for you just a couple examples here of just how these incidents were characterized here, but let me pause.